The first thing anyone heard was not the engine of a car, but the sound of silence breaking. It fell heavy and unnatural over the roadside workshop, as if the air itself had decided to pause. 3 black luxury sedans rolled in slowly, their polished bodies reflecting sunlight in a place that rarely reflected anything at all. The hum of their engines was smooth, controlled, powerful, nothing like the coughing, half-dead cars that usually limped into this stretch of road. Dust rose, then settled. Conversation stopped. Even the flies seemed to hesitate. The workshop was little more than a wooden shed stitched together with old planks and tarpaulin. Rusted tools hung from bent nails. Tires were stacked like forgotten memories. The ground was soaked with oil and years of sweat. This was where Daniel Harper lived, worked, and slept. Daniel did not look up. He sat on a low stool near the open edge of the shed, his back slightly curved, his shoulders tense but gentle. His hands were dark with grease, the lines on his palms permanently stained no matter how much he scrubbed them. In his right hand was a small metal spoon. In his left, a cracked white plate holding a simple meal that had already gone cold. Leaning against him was a little girl. She could not have been more than 9 years old. Her body was frighteningly light, as if there was more absence than flesh beneath her faded clothes. Her hair hung loosely around her face, tangled and dull. Her lips were dry, almost colorless. Her eyes were half open, unfocused, struggling to stay present. Daniel lifted the spoon carefully and blew on it, even though the food no longer steamed. "Easy now," he said softly, his voice barely louder than the breeze. "Small bites. You're safe." The girl opened her mouth with effort. Her jaw trembled. Daniel waited, patient, steady, until she managed to swallow. He did not rush her. He never did. Behind him, the doors of the lead car opened. Several men stepped out, dressed in dark suits that looked painfully out of place against the dirt and rust. Their eyes moved quickly, scanning the area, alert and tense. One of them spoke quietly into his wrist. Another adjusted his jacket, as if the heat offended him personally. Then a tall man in a gray suit emerged. He did not scan the area. He did not speak. He did not even seem to notice the workshop at first. His eyes locked onto the child. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like fear had physically struck him. His steps slowed, then faltered. The confident posture of a man used to command collapsed into something fragile, almost childlike. He took 2 more steps forward, and his knees hit the dirt. "Emily!" he whispered. The name cracked as it left his mouth. His hands trembled as he reached out, stopping just short of touching her, as if afraid she might disappear. "My baby!" The world, for Daniel, narrowed to a single breath. 3 days earlier, there had been rain. The kind of rain that soaked everything without mercy, turning the roadside into thick brown mud and the sky into a dull, endless gray. Daniel had been closing the workshop for the night, his body aching from a day that had barely earned enough to buy dinner. He was dragging a torn tarpaulin across the open side of the shed when he heard it. It was not a cry. It was weaker than that. A sound caught between breath and silence. Daniel froze. He listened again, his heart beginning to beat faster. The sound came from behind the workshop, near the pile of old tires he had meant to sell but never had time to sort. He stepped carefully, his boots sinking into the mud, and pushed the tires aside. That was when he saw her. She lay curled on her side, half covered by dirt and rainwater, her body so thin it looked wrong, unreal. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, as if even breathing required permission. When Daniel knelt and touched her shoulder, her eyes fluttered open for a moment, then drifted shut again. She did not speak. Daniel did not ask questions. He did not search her pockets. He did not think about danger or consequences. He did not consider how little he had. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. Inside the workshop, he laid her on the only bench that was not completely broken. He wiped her face with a rag that had once been clean and poured water slowly between her lips until she swallowed. Then he locked the shed, walked through the rain to a nearby kiosk, and spent nearly all the money he had left. Rice, eggs, pain relief tablets, clean water. That night, Daniel slept on the floor beside the bench, waking every hour to make sure she was still breathing. By morning, she was alive. From that day on, his routine changed. He fed her every morning and every night, spoon by spoon. He spoke to her even when she did not answer. He cleaned her wounds. He shared his food, even when it meant he ate less. Sometimes he skipped meals entirely. Neighbors noticed. "Why are you wasting food?" one man asked, leaning against the workshop entrance. "She looks like she won't make it." Daniel did not look up as he stirred the pot. "If she dies," he replied calmly, "let it not be because I refuse to help." Word spread quickly. Some shook their heads. Some laughed. A few warned him to be careful. Daniel listened to none of it. He worked less, earned less, but every time the girl managed a weak swallow, every time her eyes stayed open a little longer than the day before, it felt like something precious was happening right in front of him. On the fourth morning, the convoy arrived. Daniel felt it before he saw it. The air changed. The road felt quiet. He pulled the girl closer to him instinctively, fear tightening his chest. Poor men learned early not to trust sudden power, especially when it arrived unannounced. The men in suits moved with purpose now, forming a loose circle around the workshop. One of them started to speak, then stopped when the man in the gray suit raised a hand. That man moved forward slowly, his eyes never leaving the child. Daniel stood halfway, uncertain, ready to protect her with his body if he had to. The man stopped in front of them. He looked at Daniel for the first time then, really looked at him. At the oil-stained clothes, the tired eyes, the spoon still held carefully in his hand. Then he looked back at the girl. His breath broke. He dropped to his knees again, this time closer, close enough that Daniel could hear him shaking. "Emily," he said, his voice barely holding together. "I've been looking everywhere." Daniel felt the world tilt. The girl stirred weakly at the sound of the name. Her eyelids fluttered, her fingers twitched. And in that moment, surrounded by dust, rust, and silence, Daniel understood that the dying child he had fed with his last spoonful of hope was not just someone forgotten by the world. She was someone the world had been desperately searching for. He gave her his last meal. She gave him a reason to hope. This is just the beginning of Daniel and Emily's story. If this touched your soul, subscribe for the next chapter and share this to spread a little more light today. Remember, no act of kindness is ever too small. Emily collapsed the moment her father's trembling fingers brushed her cheek. It happened so suddenly that Daniel barely had time to react. 1 second she was leaning weakly against him, breathing shallow but steady, and the next her body went limp, her head rolling back as if the strength holding her upright had finally given up. "Emily!" the man in the gray suit shouted, his voice tearing through the silence. Everything exploded into motion. One of the men in black suits rushed forward, another already shouting orders into a device clipped to his ear. A medical bag appeared from nowhere. Someone knelt beside Daniel, checking the girl's pulse. Another man gently but firmly took her from Daniel's arms. Daniel stood frozen. For 3 days, he had fed her, watched her breathe, measured her life in small swallows and slow blinks. He had prepared himself for weakness, even death. But watching her collapse in front of him felt like the ground dropping away beneath his feet. "She's alive," a voice said sharply. "But she's crashing." The man in the gray suit, Richard Cole, did not hesitate. "Now," he ordered. "Get her in the car." Daniel found himself pushed forward with them, his legs moving before his mind caught up. He watched as they laid Emily gently across the back seat of the lead sedan, oxygen already being fitted over her face. Her chest rose shallowly, unevenly. The door slammed shut. Daniel stopped. This was where it ended, he thought. This was where people like him were left behind. Richard turned back just before getting into the car. His eyes met Daniel's. "You," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "You're coming with us." Daniel opened his mouth, unsure what to say, but one of the security men was already guiding him forward. He slid into the car beside Emily, the smell of leather and antiseptic unfamiliar and overwhelming. The convoy moved fast. Sirens cut through traffic as the city blurred past the windows. Daniel sat stiffly, his hands clenched together, watching the rise and fall of Emily's chest as if his attention alone could keep her alive. Richard sat opposite him, his face pale, his eyes never leaving his daughter. "How long?" Richard asked quietly. 3 days, Daniel answered. "Maybe more. I don't know how long she was there before I found her." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, pain flickering across his face. "You fed her?" "Yes." "Every day?" "Yes." Richard nodded slowly, as if each word was something he needed to hold on to. They reached the hospital in minutes. Doctors and nurses rushed out as soon as the car stopped. Emily was wheeled through sliding doors, her small body swallowed by bright lights and movement. Daniel followed instinctively until a nurse stopped him. "You'll have to wait here." He stopped. For the first time since he found her, Daniel was powerless. Hours passed. Daniel sat on a plastic chair in the waiting area, his clothes still stained with oil and dust, his presence almost invisible among the quiet efficiency of the hospital. Richard paced back and forth, making phone calls, answering questions, issuing instructions that Daniel did not understand. Finally, a doctor approached. "Severe dehydration. Infection. Malnutrition," the doctor said, his voice measured. "She's very weak. We're doing everything we can." Richard nodded, his jaw clenched. "Save her." The doctor nodded and walked away. Daniel stared at the floor. He replayed every moment in his head, every spoonful. Every night he wondered if she would still be breathing by morning. Doubt crept in, sharp and cruel. Had he waited too long? Had he done enough? The hours dragged on. At 3:17 in the morning, the doors opened again. Richard was on his feet instantly. Daniel stood as well, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. "She's stable," the doctor said. "Barely, but she's stable." Richard let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in his chest for days. "She's asking for someone," the doctor added. "She keeps saying a name." Richard frowned slightly. "Who?" "Daniel." Daniel froze. Richard turned to him slowly, disbelief and something deeper crossing his face. They were led into the room. Emily lay surrounded by machines, her small body swallowed by white sheets. Her eyes were open now, dull but aware. When she saw Daniel, her lips moved. He stepped closer without thinking, his voice soft. "I'm here." Her fingers twitched, barely lifting from the bed. Richard watched the exchange, understanding settling into his bones. Something inside him shifted. Over the next days, Emily remained under close care. Daniel stayed nearby, sleeping in a chair, refusing to leave even when staff offered him better accommodations. Richard noticed everything. The way Daniel spoke to her gently, the way Emily relaxed when he was near, the way this man, who owed them nothing, had given her everything he had. Richard did not thank Daniel with words. He acted. Within weeks, Daniel's life began to change in ways he could barely process. Richard ensured Emily's recovery, continued at the best facility money could buy. Then, he turned his attention to the man who had saved her. Daniel's workshop was inspected, then closed temporarily. He panicked at first, thinking he had done something wrong. But soon trucks arrived. Workers followed. Plans were drawn. The shed was torn down. In its place rose a modern automotive complex, clean and bright, equipped with machines Daniel had only ever seen in magazines. Young men from the neighborhood were hired and trained. The business opened its doors not just to paying customers, but to ambulances, fire trucks, and anyone stranded without help. Daniel watched it all in disbelief. "Why are you doing this?" he finally asked Richard one afternoon. Richard looked at him steadily. "Because my daughter is alive." Daniel had no answer for that. Despite everything, he remained the same. He arrived early, left late, worked with his hands, refused to act like the world owed him anything. Emily visited often. At first, she came in a wheelchair, then with a walker, then on her own 2 feet. Each visit, she smiled a little more, laughed a little louder. Daniel watched from a distance, grateful and careful, unaware that the quiet bond formed in suffering was far from finished. But for now, all that mattered was this. A girl who should have died was alive, and a poor mechanic had learned that sometimes choosing kindness could change the direction of entire lives. Time has a quiet way of changing things without asking permission. The girl who once lay motionless on a wooden bench grew taller, stronger, and surer of herself with each passing year. Emily Cole no longer moved through the world cautiously. Her steps were steady now. Her laughter, once rare and fragile, came easily. Her eyes carried curiosity instead of fear. Daniel Harper watched all of it from a careful distance. The automotive complex bustled with activity every day. Engines hummed, Tools clinked. Young apprentices moved with confidence as Daniel guided them patiently. The place had become more than a business. It was a second chance for many, including Daniel himself. Emily visited often. At first, her visits were filled with quiet gratitude. She would sit in Daniel's office, ask questions about engines, tease him about his stubborn habits, and listen closely when he spoke. She remembered everything. The small details, the routines, the tone of his voice when he explained something carefully. As the years passed, those visits changed. She no longer came as a recovering child, checking on the man who saved her. She came as a woman who had grown into her own mind and heart. Daniel noticed it long before he admitted it to himself. He noticed the way she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. The way conversations lingered longer than necessary. The way silence between them felt full instead of empty. He fought it quietly. There were reasons. Too many reasons. He was older. He came from nothing. His hands were rough, his past complicated. He carried a history he rarely spoke about, one that never truly released its grip on him. Emily belonged to a world of polished floors and expectations, of boardrooms and influence. She deserved ease. He had only ever known struggle. So when she finally said it, Daniel felt the ground shift beneath his feet. They were standing outside the workshop as evening settled in, the sky painted in slow colors of orange and gray. The day's noise had faded. Emily leaned against the railing, watching the last of the apprentices leave. "I don't come here just to visit anymore," she said softly. Daniel turned toward her, sensing the weight in her voice. "Then why do you come?" She met his eyes. There was no hesitation in hers. "Because I love you." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. Daniel felt his chest tighten. His first instinct was denial, then fear, then the urge to protect her from himself. "You shouldn't say that," he replied carefully. "You don't understand what you're saying." "I understand exactly what I'm saying," Emily said. "I've had years to understand it." Daniel shook his head. "Emily, I'm not the man you think I am." She stepped closer. "You're the man who fed me when I was dying. The man who stayed when you had nothing to gain. I know who you are." He looked away. That night, Daniel did not sleep. Memories crept in, unwelcome and persistent. A younger version of himself. Bad decisions made under pressure. Friends who were not really friends. A night that ended with flashing lights and cold metal around his wrists. He had never been convicted, but the arrest alone had been enough to stain his name. Enough to teach him that the past never truly stayed buried. By morning, he had decided, he would not allow Emily to tie her future to his shadows. He kept his distance. Days passed, then weeks. Emily noticed. She tried to speak to him, but Daniel was always busy, always distracted, always careful not to cross the invisible line he had drawn. It hurt her, but she did not push. Not yet. Richard Cole noticed too. One evening, Richard found Daniel alone in the workshop, working late. He watched for a moment before speaking. "You're avoiding her," Richard said. Daniel did not look up. "I'm being responsible." Richard crossed his arms. "By hurting her?" Daniel finally met his gaze. "By protecting her." Richard studied him. "From what?" "From my past," Daniel replied. "From the truth about me." Richard was silent for a long moment. "My daughter chooses her own life," he said eventually. "And she chose you." Daniel's voice dropped. "She doesn't know everything." Richard nodded slowly. "Then tell her." Daniel did not answer. The truth was harder to say out loud than he had imagined. He feared the look that might cross her face, the disappointment, the possibility that the image she held of him would shatter. So he waited. That was when Mark Lewis reappeared. Daniel recognized him instantly, even before the man spoke. The sharp eyes, the familiar posture, the quiet resentment that never quite faded. Mark stood at the edge of the workshop one afternoon, watching the activity with a thin smile. "Didn't think I'd find you here," Mark said. "Living like a king." Daniel's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" Mark shrugged. "Just curious how far a man can climb when people forget who he used to be." Daniel felt the warning settle deep in his chest. "Leave," he said calmly. Mark laughed softly. "Relax. I'm not here to cause trouble." "Not yet." Daniel watched him go, unease lingering long after he disappeared from sight. That night, Daniel sat alone in his small apartment, a place he rarely used. He pulled out a worn folder from the back of a drawer. Inside were old documents, creased and yellowed. Records he had kept as a reminder of where he came from and what he never wanted to return to. He stared at them until his eyes burned. He thought of Emily, her trust, her unwavering belief in him. By morning, his decision was made. He would stop running. When he saw Emily later that day, he did not avoid her. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. She listened without interrupting as he spoke about his past, about the arrest, about the fear that followed him even now, about his belief that he was not worthy of the life that had unfolded around him. When he finished, he waited for her to step back. She did not. Instead, she took his hands. "You think that's what defines you," she said. "But I know what does." Tears blurred his vision. In that moment, Daniel realized that love did not erase fear. It demanded courage. And for the first time since the night he found her behind the tires, Daniel Harper chose not to hide. What he did not know was that the truth he had just faced would soon be tested in a way he could never have imagined. The wedding hall was filled with light. Soft music floated through the air, steady and warm, as guests took their seats. Crystal chandeliers reflected gentle gold across polished floors. Everything about the place spoke of care, intention, and a future carefully chosen. Daniel Harper stood at the front, hands clasped in front of him, his posture straight but tense. He wore a simple, well-fitted suit that still felt unfamiliar on his shoulders. His palms were dry, yet his fingers trembled slightly. He had fixed engines under pressure, negotiated with suppliers, built a business from nothing. None of that compared to how exposed he felt standing there. Across the room, Emily appeared. For a moment, everything else faded. She moved slowly, gracefully, her eyes locked on his. There was no hesitation in her steps, no doubt in her expression. She smiled, and Daniel felt something inside him loosen, just a little. Richard Cole watched from the front row, his expression unreadable, his hands folded tightly. He had approved of this union with careful thought, but today, his role was not that of a powerful executive. He was simply a father giving his daughter away. The officiant began to speak. Daniel listened, but only half of the words reached him. His mind drifted, uninvited, to memories he had spent years trying to keep quiet. He reminded himself that he had told Emily everything, that she knew him fully, that there were no secrets left between them. Then the doors opened. The sound cut through the room sharply, jarring and out of place. A man stepped inside, his presence instantly shifting the air. His movements were deliberate, his gaze fixed forward. Daniel recognized him before his name echoed through the hall. Mark Lewis. Murmurs rippled through the guests as Mark walked down the aisle, a folder clenched in his hand. "This wedding cannot continue," Mark said loudly. The music stopped. Every eye turned toward Daniel. Emily froze. Daniel felt his chest tighten, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure others could hear it. He knew this moment had been coming. He had felt it in his bones since the day Mark reappeared. "What is this?" the officiant asked. Mark laughed softly. "This man standing here is not who you think he is." He turned toward the guests, raising the folder. Daniel Harper was arrested years ago. Criminal charges. Police records. You can dress him up all you want, but the truth doesn't disappear. Gasps filled the room. Emily turned slowly to Daniel. Her eyes searched his face, not with accusation, but with confusion and concern. Daniel lowered his head. He could have spoken. He could have defended himself. But the weight of old shame pressed down on him, heavy and familiar. He had lived with it long enough to recognize its grip. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, not to the room but to Emily. Mark smirked. "Sorry won't change facts." Silence stretched. Then a voice cut through it, calm and authoritative. "That is enough." An older man stepped forward from the side of the room, dressed plainly, his posture upright. Those who recognized him shifted immediately. Inspector Grant. He walked to the front without haste, his eyes briefly meeting Daniel's before turning to the guests. "Yes," the inspector said clearly. "Daniel Harper was arrested." Mark smiled wider. "But," the inspector continued, "that is not the full story." The room grew still. "Years ago," Inspector Grant said, "a group of men planned a crime. They wanted Daniel involved. He refused. Not quietly. Not halfway. He refused completely. Mark's smile faltered. They threatened him. Pressured him. When the police intervened, Daniel was taken in along with others. But during questioning, one thing became clear. He had not participated. He had not benefited. He had not betrayed his principles. Inspector Grant turned toward Daniel. His reputation for honesty spread, even among criminals. A murmur moved through the hall. When Emily Cole was kidnapped, the inspector went on, the criminals panicked as pressure increased. They needed somewhere to leave her alive, somewhere they believed she would be helped, not ignored. He paused. They chose Daniel Harper's workshop. Emily's breath caught. They trusted that he would do what was right, Inspector Grant said. And he did. The room erupted, not with noise, but with emotion. Shock, realization, understanding. Daniel lifted his head slowly. Inspector Grant continued. Daniel Harper saved Emily Cole twice. Once years ago, by refusing to become someone he was not. And again, when he fed her with his own hands while she was dying. Mark stepped back, his face pale now, the folder slipping from his grip. Emily turned fully toward Daniel. Tears streamed down her face, but her expression was firm. You never lied to me, she said softly. You were afraid. That's all. She took his hands. Daniel's vision blurred. Richard Cole stood then. He walked forward, his step steady, his gaze fixed on Daniel. I searched the world for my daughter, Richard said.